10 Ways to Survive the Titanic. Imagine a night, black as a raven's wing, without a single star, without the moon, without even a hint of light in the abyss stretching endlessly around the ocean. The water isn't just water. It's a mirror polished to impossible smoothness, as if nature itself had frozen in anticipation of something dreadful. And then, impact. Not loud, not deafening, but dull, almost polite, as if the ship had merely brushed against something invisible beneath the surface. But that was enough. That was enough to overturn the fates of 2,228 people. Enough to etch the name Titanic forever into the chronicles of human pride and tragedy. Now ask yourself, what would you have done if you'd been aboard that giant on that fateful night? Not in a movie, not in a novel, but in reality, amidst the cold, the panic, and utter darkness. Today, we won't talk about how the ship sank or who was to blame. We'll talk about how one could have survived. Yes, survived. Because even in the most hopeless disaster, there's a chance, there's a choice. There are 10 paths that might have saved a life if only a person had known them in advance, hadn't panicked, and hadn't believed in the unsinkability of steel or their own good fortune. First, you had to stay alert. Not literally sleepless, although that mattered too, but vigilant. The Titanic didn't sink instantly. 2 hours and 40 minutes passed between striking the iceberg and total submersion. A full 160 minutes, an entire lifetime, if used wisely. Many passengers, especially in first and second class, didn't even believe at first that anything serious was happening. They kept playing cards, drinking champagne, discussing the dinner menu. One steward later recalled how a woman in an elegant gown asked him, "Should we be worried?" and, receiving an evasive answer, calmly returned to her dessert. That was the crucial mistake. Underestimation. Those who sensed danger immediately, who stepped out onto the deck, who started asking questions, whose hearts began racing faster than usual, those were the ones with a chance. Because time isn't just minutes on a clock, it's an opportunity to put on a life vest, find your way to the lifeboats, figure out where the emergency exits are. And if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, whether on a ship, in a plane, or in a burning building, the first rule of survival is this: don't wait for someone to tell you it's time to run. Act on your own. Intuition is your best ally when your mind hasn't yet grasped the danger. Second, it was vital to know exactly where the lifeboats were, not just somewhere on deck, but precisely their numbers, locations, and how to get there from your cabin. The Titanic carried only 20 lifeboats, though it could have held 48. That was enough for just 1,178 people, less than half of those on board. Yet even those boats weren't filled to capacity. Some were lowered into the water half empty. Why? Because people didn't know where to go. Because officers didn't always manage the evacuation well. Because panic made it hard to hear commands. Imagine, you're running down a corridor, surrounded by screams, someone crying, someone praying, someone shoving. In that chaos, it's easy to get lost, easy to turn the wrong way, and every second counts. So whenever you board any form of transport, a liner, a train, or a plane, first thing you do is find out where the emergency exits are. Mentally walk the route. Memorize landmarks. This could save your life not only on the Titanic, but in any other emergency. Knowledge isn't just power, it's a shield. Third, you had to dress for the worst weather. Not just for the forecast, but for the absolute worst conditions imaginable. The night of April 14th to 15th, 1912 was icy. The water temperature was minus 2.2 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, a person loses consciousness in 15 minutes and dies within 30. Yet many passengers came onto the deck in evening gowns, pajamas, or thin-heeled shoes. One survivor recalled seeing a woman in a silk dress without a coat, shivering so violently she couldn't even lift her arm to put on a life vest. and yet warm coats, scarves, and gloves were available on board. People simply hadn't thought they'd need protection from the cold in April. Had they known they'd spend the night in freezing water, they would have dressed differently. So here's the simple rule. Always carry at least minimal protection against the cold, even if you're sure everything's under control, especially if you're sure. Fourth, you couldn't trust hierarchy. On the Titanic, as in the rest of the world at that time, an unwritten rule held sway. Women and children first, then men, and especially those from first class. This wasn't just etiquette, it was actual evacuation policy. But it didn't always work, or work everywhere. On the port side, where Second Officer Charles Lightoller was in charge, only women and children were allowed into the boats. On the starboard side, under First Officer William Murdoch, men were also permitted if space remained. That difference in approach cost lives. Some men who could have survived stayed aboard simply because they stood by the wrong boat. Others managed to get in because they happened to be in the right place at the right time. The lesson here is clear. Don't accept rules as absolute. Assess the situation yourself. Don't stand in line if you see others acting differently elsewhere. Don't wait for permission when your life is at stake. In a disaster, there's no room for politeness, only for the survival instinct, guided by reason. Fifth, you had to overcome fear of the water. That may sound paradoxical, since it was the water that claimed the lives of 581 people who ended up in it. But those who knew how to swim, who didn't panic, who could control their breathing, had a better chance of lasting until rescue arrived. Some survivors later described clinging to debris, empty crates, doors, anything that could keep them afloat. Iskander Nakush, a third-class passenger, spent over an hour in the water, holding on to an overturned lifeboat until he was finally pulled aboard. He wasn't a strong swimmer, but he didn't scream, flail, or waste energy. He simply held on. Many didn't die immediately from the cold, but from shock, panic, or the inability to stay calm. So if you ever end up in the water, breathe slowly, don't thrash, conserve your strength. And of course, learn to swim. It's not just a useful skill, it's a ticket to life. Sixth, you couldn't afford to lose contact with others. On the Titanic, many families were separated in the chaos of evacuation. Wives searched for husbands, mothers for children, brothers for sisters. Sometimes this cost them their lives. Those who stayed together, helped each other put on life vests, and offered moral support survived more often. This was especially true for third-class passengers who had to navigate a maze of corridors and staircases to reach the deck. Many simply didn't know the way, but those who banded together, asked questions, and followed others found their way out. So in any dangerous situation, try not to be alone. Even if you don't know the person next to you, make an agreement, help each other. Human solidarity isn't a romantic notion, it's a real survival tool. Seventh, you had to ignore rumors. In the first minutes after the collision, all sorts of stories spread through the ship. Nothing serious, just a drill. We'll dock in New York soon. The lifeboats are only for practice. Many stayed in their cabins because they believed these tales. Yet within 10 minutes of impact, water had already reached the mailroom. Within 30 minutes, it flooded the boiler rooms. Within an hour, it reached first class. The situation deteriorated rapidly, but information traveled slowly and became distorted. So the rule is this: in a crisis, rely not on rumors but on facts. See for yourself. Listen to official announcements, but verify them. Don't wait for someone to order you to act. Your life is your responsibility. Eighth, you had to remember the life vests. There were enough on the Titanic for everyone, 3,500 of them, but many didn't know how to wear them properly. Some put them on backward, others over their coats, and others simply didn't fasten them. An improperly worn vest won't save you, it sinks with you. Moreover, life vests don't protect against cold, they only keep your head above water. So if you ever find yourself in such a situation, first, put on your vest correctly, under your clothes, buckled at all straps, and only then think about warm clothing. And of course, know where they're stored, not in your neighbor's closet, but in your own cabin, under the bed, or in your wardrobe. Ninth, you couldn't wait until the last moment. Many passengers stayed on board until the very end, hoping the ship wouldn't sink, that help would arrive, that everything would be fine. But the Titanic went under quickly and without warning. Those who boarded lifeboats in the final minutes often fell into the water during lowering because the ropes weren't synchronized, and nearly everyone who remained on deck perished. The few exceptions were those lucky enough to be near overturned boats or floating debris. So if you see the situation worsening, act immediately. Don't think there's still time. In a disaster, there is no time. There's only the moment and your choice within it. And finally, 10th, you had to believe, not in miracles, not in guardian angels, but in yourself, in your ability to survive, in your determination. Because even in icy water, even in total darkness, even with no apparent chance, human beings can survive if they refuse to give up. History knows dozens of cases where people survived against all odds. On the Titanic, those who survived were the ones who kept their eyes open, who never lost hope, who kept fighting even when all seemed lost. And that's the most important lesson of all. Survival doesn't start with a life vest or a lifeboat. It starts with the thought, I will do everything I can to stay alive. So friends, if you've read this far, you've already taken the first step. You've thought about it. You've wanted to know more. And that's right. Because knowledge isn't just information. It's preparation. It's confidence. It's life. Don't wait for disaster to figure out how to survive it. Learn now. Ask questions. Read. Practice. Because in this world, nothing is impossible. Not giant ships, not insurmountable catastrophes. There are only people who are ready or unready for trials. Be ready. And then, even if an iceberg stands before you, you'll find a way through it.